I'm looking at society today, and it's like I'm watching an X-Men movie, with people that, when you watch the X-Men movies for Marvel Comics, it's like we have mutants living among us on planet Earth. And, some people don't like that, but that's a fact. We have people that live among us today on planet Earth that are happy to display themselves as if they were mutants from another planet. This is the planet Earth, where God created men, male, and women, female.
Tell Cyclops I made him a convertible.
Hello there, and Excelsior, true believers, and welcome to this here YouTube show. I'm Bridget Empire, science and culture correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, the only newspaper in Britain that got an exclusive interview with Senator Kelly about how mutants need to get in the bin, actually. It was quite interesting, wasn't it, Dan? The way that he talked about how mutants pose a danger to humans was quite similar to the way that we in the British media talk about trans people today, or Muslims for that matter, or how we used to talk about gay people. The thing is, though, loyal viewers, you can't let yourself feel empathy for these mutants. They have weird powers, and some of them just look completely icky, And some of them actually are, literally dangerous. Which obviously means they're all dangerous. I mean, my friends down at The Guardian keep telling me the same thing about trans people. And if I wasn't transgender myself, I guess I would have believed them. So maybe I should be questioning myself. I mean, if Magneto can move a whole bridge with his mind, right? Who knows what this guy, who looks just like a regular guy but with a bird beak, what could he do? We don't know. Maybe he could move a bigger bridge. Whatever he can do is probably something pretty horrific. In the same way, people like Slavoj Žižek and basically every Tory in the country and some Labour MPs have made the same connection with Isla Bryson, a dangerous criminal who obviously gives away a harsh truth. That if one member of a minority group is dangerous, obviously they all are. But for trans people, the thing is, I'm not dangerous. And, I know that well. I'm no more dangerous than any other British colonist. And so I don't know if I'm going to be publishing this interview with the good senator. I think he might have overreacted to a couple of mutants just going a bit far with their idea of revolutionary action, if I'm honest. But our backup interview option isn't really much better. Have you guys heard of Reverend William Stryker? Well, he's on a religious crusade against mutants. They're different, you see. Abominations to God. Just like the religious right say the same thing about trans people too. You see, so I don't exactly want to encourage senators with exterminationist visions of how to deal with the mutant question, nor do I want to prop up some kind of neo-Calvinist cleansing of society, which will inevitably lead to some sort of hate crime. What is it with these people anyway? That's them so dead set against mutants. What did mutants ever do to the world? Well, besides Magneto's many murders and the Scarlet Witch resetting the reality of Earth and killing half the Avengers, and, well, everything Wolverine did when he was taking a break from being the most wholesome murderer on Krakoa, and, okay, well, maybe some mutants have done some bad things, but that doesn't make all mutants bad. Besides, Magneto's, died, a few times since then. So philosophically, can we really judge him appropriately? And then there was that time the Magneto got turned into a baby. At that point, he's just a whole new guy. He's had a whole development all over again. And trans people? Well, we've not had as many chances to literally start all over again as our friend Eric Lenscher. We've done so many fewer atrocities than the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants ever did. Really? Trans people? Pretty much saints as far as I can tell, but don't tell my editors I said that, or that I disagree with the whole mutants thing after I reconsidered it. Dan puts up with it, because I saw him sleeping with the other rotted corpses downstairs, and so I have a bit of leverage over him. But if Lord Nonsbottom gets wind of the fact that I'm out here defending not only mutants, but trans people, well, let's just say I'll need the Phoenix to rescue me from the bottom of Jamaica Bay and give me magical space powers after what he'd do to me. The weird thing is, it's not just me making these comparisons either. Florida Republican Representative Webster Barnaby, on April 10th, 2023, directly compared trans people to the mutants in the popular Marvel franchise The X-Men during a debate for House Bill 1421 that would criminalize trans people using bathrooms in Florida, which, as people, is a problem because you don't just stop peeing when you transition, unfortunately for us all except for those of you who were into that sort of thing. By taking this very weird stand, broadcast on Floridian TV, Barnaby went viral, comparing people literally in the room with him to mutants, along with the very much less badass demons and imps. Now, I'm not sure if Webster Barnaby has ever read the X-Men comics, seen the TV shows, or watched the movies, because if he had, then he would know that the mutants are in fact the heroes in the X-Men stories. Or in a more sinister twist, perhaps he has. Perhaps he identifies with the villains in those stories. With Senator Kelly before he got his shit together in the 90s, for example, or with Bolivar Trask or Orcus, Reverend Stryker, and all the other people in groups that have made it their lives a mission to obliterate the perpetual metaphor for minority groups world over, the X-Men. And what does that say about the man, if that is true? I should stress before I get into the mutanty part of this video, something I found out after writing the first draft of this, which, if you know anything about trans people, will be extremely unsurprising. Webster Barnaby was born in England. So even the American transphobes are being exported from Turf Island, so, you know, you're welcome, world. I mean, he did later apologise for his comments, but he also said he stood by his words, like all of them, including somehow the apology. At this point, we just have to assume that he meant what he said, because he kind of said that. Unless he turns out to have been Mystique in disguise, which is always a possibility. It's what happened to the anti-mutant villain in the first X-Men movie, after all, like, after he got turned into a watery goo man by Magneto. Anyway, about what Barnaby said, and about how trans people, and minorities in general, compare to the Uncanny X-Men. Okay, so why don't I just start by asking you to introduce yourself to, like, the 3 people in my audience who don't already know who you are.
I'm Rosencreutz, the YouTube channel. I make things on there, and they are of a whiplash degree in terms of what the content is.
My name is Princess Weeks. I am a YouTuber and I do video essays where I talk about pulp culture and the intersections between race, gender, etc. and so forth. And I love the X-Men. And I have an X-Men tattoo, so I definitely feel somewhat qualified to discuss this.
Did you have any X-Men that you really related to when you were growing up, that you really felt connected to, or that sort of helped you understand what you were going through, you know, like as a black woman, as a queer person growing up, like?
Well, you know, I feel like obviously Storm was always just like a big thing because she, for a long time, she was like the black woman 100%. In comics. And then I always loved Rogue because she was hot and had red hair, and I was like, that's just fine. And then oddly enough, I have always liked Magneto and the Brotherhood of Mutants. I think that just like how I liked Demona from Gargoyles, I tend to have an affinity for characters who are just saying humans are trash and I'm not gonna play by their rules. And I'm just like, yeah, I get that. You know, like it's one of those things that we talk about so often about how like in these pieces of fiction, when they have like a political antagonist that has like a point, they always have to make them just like a little too terroristy so that they're like, okay, now you can't like them though. Yeah. Now you have to understand they went too far, and you can't openly say I don't care, because then you get on a list. Yeah. And then you're in trouble. So you just have to be like, yeah, you're right.
Is there any X-Men members that you relate to specifically that you feel like helped you sort of understand yourself?
It kind of bounces around for me, partially because I'll be like, oh, Gambit's cool. He's just a cool guy. That's the end of my connection to that. But then other things are like, So very generally, I have a really, really bad time when it comes to like connecting to identities or feeling like I even really have much of one that I feel connected to. There are ones I know are put unto me, but I don't like reinforcing those from some way. Like,
sure,
I factually know that there are parts of me that, if like to be identified from the outside in order to like, you know, like if a fascist is going to see me a certain way, and I'm just going to have to deal with that, even if I don't actively participate in that identity or that community, really. Like, there are things that I would be targeted for that I don't necessarily adhere to as, like, a sense of self. And so, I guess from that, shapeshifters are always really cool to me, very generally. So Mystique innately gets that. Magneto, I think, like, just the concept of his story unto itself resonated a lot with me, especially because I did work interviewing and then doing transcription work of former interviews with Holocaust survivors who were children.
Wow.
Because that's all we really have left, and barely at this point. His story in and of itself feels very grounded to history to me, and it's one of the only ones that kind of can be without being like from the 60s and 70s, and then if so has to like kind of dodge history. They're not going to tell us like what Wolverine was really doing, like in terms of like, did he march in the civil rights movement? Maybe there's probably a comic panel that shows that, but he doesn't feel grounded to the historical moments of oppression in the way that Magneto does.
You see, as long as there have been X-Men stories, there have been fun discussions about the mutant metaphor. The use of the X-Men as an analogy for struggles for equality against a system that hates and fears those who are different, of mutants as stand-ins for minority groups, with the obvious comparison being with the civil rights movements in the 60s, when the X-Men was originally created, after all. There is a popular myth that the original X-Men stories were one-to-one allegories for the different revolutionary tactics of Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, with Professor X representing Dr. King's emphasis on peaceful protests, and Magneto being more willing to use violent means to emancipate mutants from under the yoke of humanity. This comparison is pretty flimsy and falls apart quite quickly under scrutiny, not least because the public perceptions of Dr. King and Malcolm X do not necessarily reflect the reality of their methods and personalities, but also because this analogy was more of a post hoc invention. Stan Lee certainly never pushed back against it and may even have encouraged it, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence that this was the intention of the characters of Professor X and Magneto originally when they were conceived, especially since Magneto in the original Lee/Kirby run is more of a traditional cartoon villain, and it was only with Chris Claremont's legendary 1975 to the 90s run that Magneto went from mustache-twirling master of magnetism to principled if jaded revolutionary, a violent man shaped by a violent past, a Holocaust survivor who'd seen the worst humanity had to offer, and come to the conclusion that humans would never let mutants live peacefully alongside them, at least not without a fight. As Claremont himself has said, re the parallel between Dr. King and Malcolm X versus Professor X and Magneto. There's a lot of talk online now that Magneto stands in for Malcolm X and Xavier stands in for Martin Luther King, but for me, being an immigrant white, to make that analogy felt incredibly presumptuous.
The thing I think is really interesting about characters like Magneto and Professor X is that, like, so Magneto was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and they're both Jewish men. You know, Jack Kirby, notorious ready to fight Nazi person. And then the person who really took the character and brought him into sort of the classic villain, but has a really interesting point, was Chris Claremont, who is also Jewish through his mother and like was raised in a kibbutz for a while and then raised in Long Island. So I think what's really interesting when we talk about X-Men is that we are talking about a civil rights allegory made by people who, while they are white, they are still Jewish and within a generation separated from the Holocaust, most of them. And therefore they are talking about this through the lens of like trauma, of knowing just what human beings are capable of. And the optimism, I think, is built upon a desire for that to change in the real world. And I think that while I may disagree with that as a narrative and everything like that, I think the lack of cynicism isn't coming from pure ignorance, but from an optimism of like the possibility of change. Yeah, I just don't think that has happened. You know, like I think like when, you know, they're all like Chris Claremont's in his 70s, Jack Kirby passed away years ago but died in his 70s. Stan Lee only died recently in his 90s. I don't think that the things that they were optimistic about have ever happened, but I understand why for a product for ideally children and young people, you want to, you know, believe that. At the same time, you know, Stan Lee, like his family, I believe they're Romanian born Jewish, and came to America, and it's just like changed his name to, you know, pass in a lot of ways. So I think that's also a really important thing, is that a lot of people take the allegory for civil rights and make it just Black people. And while glad to be part of the conversation, I think that the context is important of like, who are the people that actually created these characters and then elevated them politically?
Because I think a lot of this narrative that comes around this is a sort of like fan created one where people are looking at Professor X and Magneto and they're saying, okay, this is MLK, this is Malcolm X. But if you look at that was never really the intention. And I guess Stan Lee didn't really argue against it enough.
Yeah, like Chris Claremont has said, it's based off of two Israeli politicians. Menachem Bening and David Ben Goran, I think, are the two. I'm bad at pronouncing. But they've mentioned that they think that it's fine, but because they're immigrant white, that was not what they were intending to do, because that would have been an overstep. And that they very are clear that it's coming out of the Holocaust trauma is where these characters come from. The Malcolm X MLK thing to me is very much rooted in a lot of just people don't know who, like, the actual politics of MLK and Malcolm X, and just feel like it's a very easy one-to-one correlation, especially when you're not as informed about things like Israeli politics or like any of those things, and you kind of like the whitewashing of comic book creators as just as white men rather than them being Jewish white men, and how that is a layer of what their viewing lens is coming from.
Yeah, I feel like it sort of takes layers away from both the characters and from the actual historical figures, especially because MLK and Malcolm X are so like misunderstood and sort of like, especially with Martin Luther King becoming very like sort of sanitized for like a modern American audience to have the teeth taken away. And
it's honestly insulting to call Professor Xavier, who is a chump, anything related to MLK, like the audacity. Like, it's very rude. For Malcolm X and Magneto, they both have like energy, so it's like, that's cute. But like, Martin Luther King is nowhere near as shady and terrible as Professor Xavier. So
100%. That's absolutely an insult to Martin Luther King. So
it's like, how dare you?
Like, I feel like if you've just seen the 90s show and you still know Professor X is like this sort of like nice mentor figure, maybe, and he's like, no. He's an asshole.
He's a bad person, very bad.
Don't let him near those children. That was a mistake. He shouldn't have been able to form the organization.
Absolutely.
The idea of like Magneto without the Holocaust having a situation of like, oh, I want to like fight for mutant liberation or mutant rights or something, it makes it seem more like he's just kind of chosen to adopt a cause kind of later on, if you don't have something that shows that he has like an innate attachment to a deep-seated trauma or like to a deep-seated oppression even. And that kind of reflects back onto the fact that Jewishness is a lot more invisible. It has an inherent passing element to it, and that is why rather famously, there have been certain discussions about, in queer circles, the idea of Jewishness actually being one of the first closets that people tended to recognize. Because there was people who would, choose to pass, who would choose to just either assimilate because they didn't really care about the religious aspect of it, or could kind of let go of the cultural, or like actively repress those things in order to pass in society.
The metaphor is more apt at least with Professor X and Magneto as sort of being Jewish in America in the 40s to 60s rather than the civil rights movement. But
I mean, there's obviously like there's overlap in those movements to some capacity. In that, like, there were a lot of smaller Jewish organizations that marched with MLK directly, like the secular humanist movement. I think there's something in certain X-Men iterations, and again, there's not like one canon, absolute, true authorial vision that happens at this point, because, they just kind of give that out to other people who then create stories in that space. But I know that there are some where people kind of have it where, for better or worse, and I guess this could be argued in either direction, they'll have the, like, visibly identifiable mutants end up either in more radical positions or just kind of so disenfranchised that they kind of tend towards being more terroristic TM, like recognizing that these people would be more marginalized because they're more like easy to point at and say that person is not human. But at the same time, whether or not you're kind of applying this as like okay, this person would be exiled from society and therefore tend towards, more radical means of dealing with that, versus this guy kind of looks like a monster and now he's doing monster things is not great.
Yeah. No, yeah. Even so, and with the context of the MLK and Malcolm X comparison stripped from the narrative, as somewhere between a myth and a convenient story to fit onto the story of the X-Men once it had already been established, the civil rights metaphor has been there since the beginning of the X-Men comics. And as you might expect from a franchise that's been running for 60 years now, the use of mutants as a metaphor for civil rights struggles, and later for gay liberation and trans liberation struggles, more common in the modern era and exemplified by the famous
Have you tried not being a mutant?
The metaphor has been handled pretty clumsily at times, and sometimes completely ham-fistedly. First, just to get a little idea of why the X-Men don't neatly line up with other persecuted minority groups, let me do a rundown of a brief, and off the top of my head, explanation of who the X-Men are and some of their early history. So, deep breaths. Professor Charles Xavier is a white disabled man with psychic powers who forms a team of essentially superpowered child soldiers from a minority group called Mutants, entered as the next stage in human evolution, very problematic, ostensibly to protect the human world that hates and fears them from other mutants, who are understandably angry at being treated like crap by humans, most notably Magneto, sometimes Eric Lenscher, sometimes Magnus, sometimes other names. He is an old friend of Professor X, who doesn't think equality between humans and mutants is possible without violence, at least in the beginning of the X-Men. Both he and Charles change their positions a bunch and become very nuanced characters. Anyway, the X-Men, a group of 4 white boys and 1 white girl called Cyclops, Beast, Iceman, Angel, and Marvel Girl, later just Jean Grey for the most part, who Professor X creeps on and is generally very sexist towards, fight Magneto along with his on and off again children, Elizabeth Olsen, Not the Flash, and best girl Polaris, who later all become good guys, with Polaris even dating Cyclops' brother Havoc, not to be confused with Cyclops' other brother, Vulcan, who we don't talk about. We don't talk about Vulcan, he's an asshole, he's very confusing, and not to be confused with the potential other brother of Cyclops and 90s blood exploding skateboard weirdo Adam X the Extreme. This original run ends pretty quickly and it's super weird. Then we get the next wave of X-Men. These characters are for the most part introduced in Giant Size X-Men number 1, include Nightcrawler, Storm, Colossus, Thunderbird, Sunfire, and some weird Hulk villain called, Wolverine? What's that, a big weasel? He'll probably not come up again. Best not to worry about him. Anyway, they all team up to fight a giant living alien called Krakoa, who they blast into space, and then the writing gets a bunch of nuance. It turns out Magneto is a Holocaust survivor, so he has pretty good reasons for thinking humans are a bunch of assholes. Professor X kills a bunch of children, Sunfire quits the team a whole bunch, Storm leads the X-Men after Claremont gets bored of Cyclops and she's incredible, Mystique turns up to lead the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants and she's a disaster bisexual whose wife can see the future, and they have a kid called Rogue, who is kind of a queer allegory and who I'm sure will not be relevant either here or in the near future. Anyway, Beast turns himself blue for a side quest and gets stuck for some reason. Jean Grey dies and comes back from the dead, becoming an evil cosmic force who wears BDSM gear and kills a planet full of broccoli people. Cyclops marries a clone of her and somehow doesn't realise it, and that clone becomes a goblin queen who turns all of New York into literal hell. The kid of Cyclops and his clone wife then gets sent to the future to save him from the most Saturday morning cartoon villains of the whole franchise, Apocalypse and Mr. Sinister, and he becomes a grizzled cyborg man with a flashing eye who runs around with big machine guns and is on and off again friends with benefits with Deadpool, who I guess also turns up at some point, but that's not really important. He's more of a side character from a side story. They got 2 big frizz boots. Anyway, Marvel editorial gets really hopped up on all the money X-Men is getting and decides it needs to ruin it. I mean, make more money off it. So they have 1 million different books with 1 million different mutants doing 1 million different things. They drive Claremont off the book, and for 10 years, everyone has giant hair, muscles, tons of pouches, but they get to be drawn by Jim Lee, so that's pretty good, I guess. And then there's the whole story that's a metaphor for the AIDS crisis, which is sort of a mixed bag and kind of problematic. And then the world ends and is reset. That actually, it happens a bunch of times, actually, and you get my point. It's complicated. It's long running. It's a soap opera. And while that makes for great entertainment and some incredible moments, it does mean that you have the same problem that every long running story has. That the quality is inconsistent. And in a story that's for the most part an allegory for the struggles of persecuted minorities against a dominant and oppressive society, when it's handled badly, it can hurt a lot more than your run-of-the-mill comic book can. Then again, when the X-Men does the mutant metaphor right, it's some of the best storytelling in the entire medium.
Yeah, so the thing about Magneto as a character is, he's one of the very few characters I can think of who has a very, temporal link to the world in that, okay, I know Wolverine is literally age immortal and, fought in the Civil War and all that different stuff, but, you could technically, you could just keep adding on to that as you go, but Magneto's backstory literally begins at Auschwitz, that has to happen. And
yeah.
I've had discussions with people before about the idea of how you could update it and have him be a survivor of a different genocide maybe, but there's, as much as I think that kind of could work, it also would change something about a character who is fundamentally like of a marginalized and endangered background. It's not just like, oh yeah, we made this character new and more relevant. It's like, well, you know, the Holocaust kind of comes up a lot still for very salient reasons.
Yeah, I think it's important, especially because like I feel like he definitely started off as much more of like a comic book villain before they added this part of his backstory, and it sort of goes the way like why he is where he is, and if you take the part of that away, it sort of detracts from it, and it's such an iconic part of his character. I feel like there's a sort of like trend in a lot of X-Men characters, especially for like people to tone down like Jewish background and stuff like that. So like Kitty Pryde is canonically Jewish, but for like 2 decades they sort of pretended that wasn't the case, even having her like do like a fake wedding which was very Christian. And I feel like that's sort of I don't want that. If that happens to Magneto, it's sort of a tragedy.
With Magneto, what they've often done is they've kind of had him bounce between the like, is he the Malcolm X figure, and like, is he just kind of a terrorist, and is he just some kind of megalomaniacal generic comic book villain guy? Like, you know, it's one of those things where the motives he has, the end goals he has, and the origin he has waver in complication and like groundedness and just like the emotional difficulty it takes to like really tackle them. Then there was the one movie where they made him like they like went in on the idea of like, yeah, he's a survivor, and also let's use that as sort of a vehicle for a little bit of fun revenge porn where he like, you know, stabs the guy in Argentina and stuff. And like, if you had that but you didn't actually have any sort of like pathos for his actual like trauma and situation, then it would have been weird if they're like, oh yeah, so he was like this, that happened, whatever, we're not going to talk about that at all. Oh, but here's him stabbing a guy. Then if you don't have the grounding, that comes off really poorly. And I think because he's such a, I mean, well, all comic book characters go through so many iterations and become like nebulous and weird in the way they exist, you risk kind of accidentally pulling in one part without the other. That arc where he was possibly part of Hydra was like the most like, why would you think to do that?
Yeah, it's not.
Why would you think to put a Holocaust survivor as part of a like para like occultist Nazi organization? I think the thing that they're kind of missing here is that like human beings are very complicated and can do stupid and troubling things even without it being like this is a response to trauma, this is him recreating that trauma. Like, you can still be someone who went through trauma and oppression who just also turns out to be a villainous and bad person. Like, that just factually happens. There are plenty of people who survived the Holocaust who went on to help found the state of Israel, and in some weird ways, like, it's not even perpetuate, because it's not like, oh, we're doing the same exact thing. It's so much as just also act in a position of oppression, also act in a position of violence. And that's not to say that Magneto is doing that, but like, people are complicated, you know? They don't just like learn to have like the absolute perfect moral compass because they were put down.
So, getting back to the original premise of the X-Men, the limits of the mutant metaphor as an allegory for the civil rights movement obviously wasn't helped by the fact that the original X-Men run had an entirely wide cast. So while ostensibly mutants were a persecuted minority group and stood in for black and minority struggles, you're looking at a bunch of white faces. This inevitably takes away some of the bite that the series later gained by including a more diverse cast, took away the potential to discuss intersectionality, and more importantly, the long and dark history of the civil rights movement in the USA that Lee and Kirby were supposedly trying to shine a light on. Can you really do a competent analogy to a group fighting from a position of not long ago having been literally enslaved by the dominant class in their society, when none of that context is there in the faces and backstories of your protagonists? Well, yes and no, but in the context of the Lee and Kirby run, mostly no. Later on, especially in the Claremont run, there are some stories that I think do a pretty good job of this, with the Sentinels taking on the role of slave catchers, for example, in Days of Future Past, and notably, basically the entirety of God Loves Man Kills. The first appearance of William Stryker, a reverend of the church who murdered his wife and newborn son after discovering that his son was a mutant, and plans to use Professor Xavier's powers along with his mutant location machine Cerebro to kill all mutants, prompting Magneto and Xavier to team up to stop this attempted genocide. This was adapted loosely into the 2003 film X-Men 2, where Stryker was changed from a religious figure to a military scientist involved in Wolverine's backstory, and later on, some use of the metaphor of queer issues are used to various degrees of success. The legacy virus, for example, is a direct metaphor for HIV/AIDS, seen as the mutant disease and allowed to spread until it kills a human. There is an arc about the Mutant Registration Act and the search for a cure for mutant kind as a metaphor for conversion therapy. Even later on, during some of the darkest days of the X-Men comics, the character of Rain Sinclair, or Wolfsbane, a beloved member of the original New Mutants lineup, is brutally murdered after being hit on by people who don't realise she's a mutant in a very on-the-nose and honestly kind of hurtful parallel to trans panic murders, in which trans women are murdered by people who pursue them sexually when they realise they are trans. And while representation for non-white mutants and some gay mutants has gone a lot better, Marvel is still a pretty conservative company and is run by Disney, which is an even more conservative company. Despite what people are trying to do with the X-Men, Marvel and Disney especially, quite conservative. And it does limit what they can do and what stories they can tell.
Yeah. I mean, like, that's the thing that I find more and more disappointing about the MCU in general. Is like, I feel like I'm having the same arguments with people about diversity that I already had with them 10 years ago. Especially like when with the Riri Williams and the America Chavez, it's like I had to Miles Morales. I'm having these arguments all over again. We did this in 2013.
Yeah,
I don't really feel like arguing about you with the validity of like Black characters existing in these movies again. Yet here we are, and I think especially like that is the catch-22 of the love that we get to a franchise that is still not made by people that are us. You know, like, as much as we can see, like, the non-binary queer allegories of certain characters, how many trans people have gotten to write for X-Men? How many of them have been allowed to benefit themselves and write themselves into these texts? Yeah. Because I think of a character like Mystique, who is, like, totally gender non-conforming, is a father in some incarnations of children, like a mother and a father.
She was supposed to be like Nightcrawler's dad, right? At some point, I don't know when they changed that around.
Yeah, there was a whole thing like Rogue was like her stepkid, and like she's supposed to have one child with Sabretooth and one child with Destiny. She has a girlfriend forever. Like, honestly, giant icon. If you were to watch the movies, you would not know that. If you were to even watch the TV shows, you wouldn't know that. It's like, no, Mystique is everybody.
Yeah,
the original Zim, like, you know, it's like they are so compelling, but that's not necessarily maybe be the intent of the writer. It might have just been like, what a twist! It was Mystique the whole time, you know, like, so it's how we have in turn given grace to these texts that, you know, sometimes deserve it, sometimes don't. You know, I think about how a lot of Black fans love the line in I believe I forget if it's X-Men 3 or X-Men 2 where Mystique goes like, I don't answer to my slave name. And like and like it's a line that could be so cringe. But at the same time, every Black person I know is like absolutely right. Like and like when it works, and when it doesn't, it's just very like difficult. Exactly. And it's one of those things as well. It's like Elliot Page was the face of the X-Men of the second half of the X-Men films, which is like amazing, but that's not the text itself. You know, that is the joy of having Elliot be such a prolific actor that they were able to not only have so many opportunities, but by being so, you know, open about their transition and their journey, now we're able to be like, we have, you know, Kitty Pryde is a trans man.
Yeah.
And that's great. But that's not what the text was. No. And I think that's what we're trying to figure out is like, how do we get there? Yeah. And I think it just means like we have to bring in the writers. It has to be like, I believe Charlie Jane Anders, who is a trans woman, she did write for the Marvel Pride.
Yeah, that was her story. Yeah.
And I'm like, but that's only one person. And it's a white trans woman. It's like, we also need to have, you know, other trans men, non-binary trans people, you know, having like a real diversity of like what that experience looks like to really honor it in the narrative. And also just allow the narratives to be stories, because that's the thing. It's like when you ghettoize Pride characters, queer characters to the Pride issues of comics, you're not incorporating them into the regular stories. What is the point of introducing a really awesome trans X-Men character if they're never going to interact with the X-Men any other time besides Pride Month?
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And that's one of the problems I had with these Pride issues. Like, as much as I love reading about them, it's like, well, we're never going to see these guys again.
And it sucks because it really is a matter of how it's been acquired. Because when you think about how, like, despite ups and downs, that we did have an era where there was a real push of getting queer people of color in these comics. Like, America Chavez, for all the mistakes they made about like not really identifying her how she was Latina, from the very jump she was a lesbian and a brown girl who had two mothers, and that was there, and that was just allowed to happen. But that is also still very like tangentially before Disney really had as much control as they do. I mean, in my opinion, even though it hasn't been confirmed, they're the reason why Wanda and Pietro are no longer Magneto's children. Because even though that itself was something that came along later, like that not happening and Age of Ultron happening are very back to back.
100%.
And that doesn't feel like a coincidence to me. And it really just comes across of them, you know, trying very, very hard to push their IP onto the comics, and the comics were just more radical than them. Even as, you know, much work as the comics needed to do, they are still light years beyond what the MCU has already done. Light years away.
Because of this, trans people don't often get to be much more than a mirror for the mutant metaphor, a loose narrative connection and allegory. There have been attempts to include us, but they haven't come to a whole lot. The most notable one I could think of from the top of my head, and this was only from the top of my head because I'm a big X-Men nerd and because I'm trans myself, was Jesse Drake, a character from Marvel Comics Presents number 150 by Ann Nocenti and Steve Lightley in 1994. Who has shape-shifting powers and who Wolverine convinces Typhoid Mary to rescue after she has been experimented on in a medical facility, with her serving as a catalyst for Mary to learn the life lesson, to go from feeling deceived by Jessie to understanding that she is indeed a girl in every way that matters. Jesse Drake only returned to comics 27 years later in a Black Cat story by Leah Williams in Marvel Voices Pride in 2022, which is where I first read about her. It's a cute story, but much like her first appearance, it's short and ultimately isn't about to put her at the forefront of the Marvel Universe. The same Pride issue featured a new trans mutant called Escapade, with a story written by trans writer Charlie Jane Anders, and she has since appeared in a few issues of New Mutants, which is pretty neat. But when you think about how long X-Men has been using trans metaphors in their stories and how many hundreds of mutants there are in these stories, this feels a little bit too little, too late. Especially considering how many trans characters DC Comics had in major stories before Marvel was drag kicking and screaming into having a couple of minor characters be canonically transgender. Yes, I stan Alicia Leo and Gail Simone's entire run on Batgirl. Everyone should read it. I know ACAB probably includes Batgirl, but come on, let me have this one, please. There was obviously these comments recently comparing trans people to mutants in the Florida house. Obviously, that's ridiculous. But also, like, I think I wanted to ask whether, like, as a queer person, you sort of see that as a compliment-ish. Like, for me, like, I feel like Mutant and Proud is sort of like a thing that I've come into. But,
yeah.
I
think I retweeted on my Twitter like a Magneto was right behind the trans flag.
Yeah.
Because it's like, because to me that comparison is just very 2000 and late. It's like, have you tried not being a mutant? Can happen in 2002. I don't know why you think that we don't know that this is who we are. You know, we are who we are. And I think that queer people have already just kind of like appropriated not even appropriated, like the X-Men is very much has been throughout the history of its existence been tied to marginalized groups of people. I mean, Iceman is like one of the first really big queer, big gay men in comics that way. So to me, it's like, it's an insult only if you like don't know anything about the X-Men. You know what I mean? It's like, they're the stars of the show. They are the most popular Marvel IP before the MCU ever existed. They're still the best IP that Marvel has. So to me, I'm like, cool. Who are you, Robert Kelly? Are you going to create, like, you can't even recycle. Like, who are you to tell me, yeah, I'm a mutant. It's fine.
Like, he wants to be the villain from the... I'm like, why? You volunteer yourself to be the villain.
Why do you want to be the evil politician that gets turned into a glob in the first X-Men movie? I don't understand.
With all of that said, and this is important, the X-Men are popular for a reason, and the mutant metaphor does resonate with many of us. When I was growing up as a closeted trans person, I related deeply to the character of Nightcrawler, a charming and genuinely kind person who struggled to be seen as human due to his appearance. Nightcrawler was not human passing and resembled a literal demon, despite being genuinely lovely and even a devout Christian, depending on which version of the character we're talking about, in contrast to his appearance. In X-Men Evolution, one of my favourite shows growing up, Nightcrawler would constantly have to wear an image inducer, much like he did in the comics during the Claremont run. What she used to disguise himself as a human, his true appearance suppressed to fit in with society. It's not hard to see how that rang true as a closeted trans woman, right? The parallels are right there. I identified very strongly with Kitty Pryde as well, mainly because I just wanted to be her, but she was also the entry point character for a long time in the X-Men, which was important because she's a young, female, Jewish, bisexual, and as X-Men went on, it would try to explore these intersections of identity and how they interact with mutanthood. Another character that's close to my heart in terms of both the allegory and her personality is Rogue, a character that cannot make skin-to-skin contact with anyone without stealing their memories and powers, leading her to withdraw, constantly wear gloves, and suppress her romantic urges in some cases. The queer allegories write themselves. Expressing your love is seen as dangerous. Your desires are pure, but they can cause pain to both you and your partner due to circumstances out of your control. The fact that Rogue eventually ends up happily married to Gambit in canon is a really satisfying way to move this queer allegory into the 21st century, where queer love is more widely accepted by society, and even if homophobia remains rife and a danger from homophobes is still very much active, we have learned to be proud, to let ourselves be happy, to love each other on our own terms despite what society thinks. Because we want to, because we need to. The mutant metaphor can genuinely make people feel seen when they have never felt seen before. It can give us ways to understand our struggles that most stories cannot. And that's the power of a good metaphor. With it, we can learn to understand ourselves in a way we might not be open to if directly confronted with our reality. But obviously, we don't care. Everyone loves the X-Men. We're proud to be X-Men. One of the mutants I really identified with as a kid was a Nightcrawler. Precisely because, yeah. Because you're going around as a trans person, you're people see you as something you're not, and you're trying to show that you're a good heart person, but people just see this devil. It's the queer metaphor just writes itself. Mm-hmm. And that sort of got me back to the concept of passing in mutant terms. And there's still a question I think I have in my head is how much the series still focusing on human and passing mutants is sort of restricting the story and the metaphor to where it could possibly go. I don't know what you think about that.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think I even said in the TikTok I did, following up to it, is it's not a great allegory. It's limited because it's again, we don't have powers. If I could, implant my mind into people's dreams, I wouldn't be doing YouTube videos. I would be rich.
Yes.
I would be doing other things. So of course, people would be like, well, I have all these powers, and there's a rationale that people can have to be afraid of mutants versus actual people. And I think that to a degree, it's one of the things where this is a comic book series. It is made for children to try and teach empathy. The problem is that that empathy can be eroded very quickly and over time. I think that we live in a very interesting time because I feel because of the monster fucker contingency, we have a lot less need for humanoid mutants. I feel for example, you mentioned Nightcrawler. I feel if you're a queer person, you wanted to be best friends with Nightcrawler, your favorite Ninja Turtle is Donatello, and you really, really, really enjoy fine cuisine. It's just part of your experience. And I feel with the X-Men, as imperfect as an allegory as it is, the reason why it is effective is that it does, in a lot of ways, really address the isolation and the fear and the constant urgency of needing things to change. And I think that's why the Brotherhood of Mutants is so interesting, because they are overall not passing. It's Mystique who is blue. It's Toad, Blob, and other characters who do not physically fit the sort of beauty ideal. I think for the X-Men, you had Nightcrawler, but he was later. Then you had Beast, who first was humanoid, but then used his feet and eventually became blue. So, there's Angel, whose power they have angel wings. No one's gonna be mad at you about that.
No.
So it wasn't until later that they were able to be a lot clearer about it. And then also have the intersections happen, because then you get Kitty Pryde, who is Jewish and a mutant, and then, says the N-word a few times to make a point. It's Kitty, no. But, the series in itself is aware of these intersections. And under the right writers, like a Chris Claremont, you do get a lot more discussion of how, the mutants are only one part of a marginalized identity. There are others that are existing parallel to them, and that also matters. Like, it matters for Storm to be not just a mutant but a Black woman, and a lot of people have even recontextualized her as a Black woman, how she got brought into the X-Men like as a goddess, and then Professor Xavier's like, no, you're actually just a mutant, come work at my school. And it's like, no. So I think as the stories have evolved and more writers from different intersections have come, they've been able to take the general allegory and elevate it and really put in characters so that you can have more going on there. I think the problem that ends up happening, as in most mainstream fandom things that are liberal very fragrantly, but the audience is not, is that they just kind of like ignore it. You know, as someone who got into Star Trek a couple years ago, like my mom's a Trekkie, but like I watched Deep Space Nine recently, and I was just like, how do like white conservatives watch the show? Yet they do. You know, it's just very confusing. I don't understand. I don't know how you can watch this.
They got past bar association, like.
Yeah, I don't. It's like, it was funny. I was like, even with Star Wars, it's like they're like with the recent stuff with Lizzo, and they were mad about it. It's like, you know, George Lucas's wife is Black, right? Like, I don't know what are you guys upset about? Like, what's going on? And like with X-Men, it's so weird because even with the announced with the animated series, they're like, it's gonna be woke. And I'm like, how embarrassing for you! How embarrassing for you to say woke about the X-Men unironically. Yeah.
How can you what do you even say to that?
Do you even X-Men? Like, I don't even understand how you could say that. And I think what sucks about the MCU, especially because of how the MCU acquired Marvel and because of how they acquired it, the X-Men were kind of pushed to the side, is that you lose a lot of the really interesting dynamic between mutants and the Avengers. Because that's like, even take something like Civil War, for example, like, and the Registry, like the mutants were very much against that for a lot of reasons, because they are a marginalized group who has been subjected to that. Like, you need them as a comparison about what it's like to exist in this world, not as a superhero that's loved, but as someone who tries to do good things but is still treated disrespectfully because of what they are. And then you get the whitewashing of Wanda as a Jewish person, as a Romani person, and you get like this very clear lack of understanding that these stories, while they have been made into the mainstream, all of them are really about trying to fight against injustice and knowing that there are limits to the police, the law, to order, and that sometimes you have to do different things. And I think the X-Men is the best at that within the genre, despite its failings. And I think that I wish that audiences were just better critical thinkers so that we could enjoy it more instead of having to always have to reiterate that, like, yes, we understand that Magneto is taking it too far. We understand that it's bad and he wants to kill all of humanity. Yeah. We understand. We're just saying that we understand why he wants to do it. We're not saying
he was right, though.
Like, honestly, you haven't done anything to make me believe that he should do it. So, like...
So despite clumsy uses of the mutant metaphor to tell trans stories, when it is done right, the X-Men as a metaphor for minority struggles is beautiful. Yes, it struggles sometimes with being on the nose or giving a white man's reductive view of the civil rights struggle, but it also has the capacity to tell beautiful stories, to really touch your heart. The final character I relate to strongly in the X-Men lineup, and probably my favourite of the bunch, although I do have a soft spot for magic, is Laura Kinney, formerly X-23, now Wolverine, daughter of the other Wolverine, who will be the subject of a whole different video, because, oh boy, do I have thoughts on our friend Logan that would completely derail this one. Laura spends much of her early history struggling with being raised to be something she rejects at her core. She is raised as an assassin by the Weapon X program, and ends up alone, orphaned, and traumatized by the people that raised her, controlling her actions she ostensibly did herself. She struggles deeply with self-actualization, is treated pretty horribly by society, goes through a bunch of horrible and self-destructive things that I will spare you from hearing about for the slim chance this video will remain monetized, and all of this while believing that she is a clone, that she is a copy purpose-built for killing. And while she believes this, she rejects it, and she chooses her own destiny. Eventually rescuing her sisters and creating a strong family unit with Honey Badger, who is the absolute sweetest, I would die for her, Jonathan, actual Wolverine, Daken, Wolverine's son, and Logan himself, who slowly comes around and recognises her as both his daughter and as worthy of the name Wolverine in her own right. It's beautiful. And I really relate to her for a number of reasons. As a trans person, as a queer person, as someone whose life was predetermined by society to be in the wrong gender, living the wrong life, and as somebody who has had to start over several times, finding my own place in the world with love and happiness despite whatever the world throws at me. That's why I love the X-Men. And this is why, despite its flaws, I can't help but appreciate what the mutant metaphor can do. And if trans people are compared to mutants, I'll take it. They're the bloody heroes, after all, and some of them do stand in for us, even if others do less of a good job. Because mutants like an imperfect allegory, and because they are sort of this power fantasy for marginalized groups, it sort of works in a way that wouldn't if you were directly being like, this is the fixed allegory and now it's over. Like, the sort of vagueness is sort of what makes it so popular, maybe. I don't know.
I think that, you know, the weirdest thing is, though, like, I feel like if you are Black and queer, it's not that vague. Yeah. I think it's kind of thing that I think is weird for me is that, like, it's what if you just watch any of the movies, watch any incarnation, it's very obvious what the politics of it is. Yeah. I think the fault is that as a society, when you default to whiteness, and a whiteness that is so separated from any kind of intersection, and that's what people are making art for, people assume that all art is made for them.
Yeah.
And they just completely ignore the creators. Like, there are anti-Semitic people who probably love Stan Lee and don't know that he's Jewish. Because to them, that's not even...
It's not on their radar.
In their mind. It's not on their radar. It's not on their mind. You know, they are content to just take the art, take the entertainment, and not give a shit about who made it. And if that's the case, then you can't really fight against that, except with you know, education. But if they don't want to receive it, what are you supposed to do? And I think that's kind of like the catch-22 of, like, anybody who makes art and is marginalized but is making it for, like, a broad audience, is that there's a very fair chance that the audience that receives your art are not often the people that you would want to be in community with.
With all that said, however, and keeping my praises for the metaphor done well in mind, despite however the X-Men comics handle the mutant metaphor, the idea of the mutant metaphor is the backbone of the entire franchise. Without it, the X-Men aren't the X-Men, they're just another superhero team. And because of this fact, when the metaphor is handled badly, it really misses the mark, and it has the chance to even hurt the groups it's trying to help with the soap opera's civil rights metaphor narrative. As Everett Christian says of Comics SXF, what is the mutant metaphor? There are articles, a book, at least one dissertation and podcast on this topic. It is the subject of intense debate and has been for decades. The mutant metaphor is the conceit of mutants to stand in for any minority group. Mutants have stood in for disability and identity politics. Genosha was used as both a South African apartheid metaphor and then again as a Zionist metaphor. The U-Men were used as a stand-in for gentrification and cultural appropriation. The legacy virus was an AIDS metaphor. The purifiers so closely aligned to the KKK they might as well wear pointy hats. The metaphor isn't so much important as it is vital to the franchise. There are no X-Men without a world that hates and fears them. This is what gives the X-Men pathos and makes it a compelling story. A team of ragtag minorities thrust together trying to survive while being beleaguered on all fronts, including systematically from the government itself. Most people can see themselves in the mutant metaphor. It's stretched to accommodate race, sexuality, and creed. The framework of the metaphor are the themes of bigotry and the triumph over it. Enacting the power fantasy of taking arms to end injustice, tyranny, and oppression has so often been the subject of the comics themselves. Once you have linked the concept of mutants to that of the persecuted, their triumph becomes the triumph of the oppressed. Defeating Cameron Hodge for the nth time is still functionally similar to Captain America punching Hitler in the face. The willingness to tell such tales is a part of the value and importance of the franchise. Stories that dilute, confuse, or undo the framework erase the very real cost that minorities in America pay. It erases the links between mutants and the real people they represent. And yet, as much as X-Men fans love and need the mutant metaphor and appreciate all it can do, we recognise that it is limited, and that those limits can be incredibly frustrating. Magneto, after all, can do what no other member of a minority can. Would that I could move metal with my mind. Trans rights now wouldn't just be a chant at rallies, it would be on the bloody agenda, boys. Thomas Bacon for Screen Rant put this quite well in a response to a recent issue of Immortal X-Men, where Professor X directly addresses the mutant metaphor, its strengths and its weaknesses as a storytelling device. When a child comes out to bigoted parents, it destroys lives, Professor X reflects. When Magneto came out as a mutant, he killed a whole town in his grief. Being a mutant shares traits with other persecuted groups, but it is unlike it in one way. We are dangerous. Oddly enough, this is probably the reason the X-Men work as a symbol of diversity in the first place. In the real world, victims of bigotry and prejudice often struggle with a sense of powerlessness and lack of agency, but mutants are victims of prejudice who possess far greater power than those who would persecute them. In a sense, the X-Men represent a power fantasy. They allow those who the world would strip of power to imagine regaining it. In doing so, they inspire people to change the world in which they live rather than simply accept it. The most powerful X-Men are, in a way, a far better symbol precisely because the metaphor only goes so far. This may be true in the real world, but the same is not necessarily the case in-universe. Professor X has often tried to tie the battle for mutant rights to other social movements, but it has usually been a brief reference, a comparison to try and get people thinking. He's never really committed to it, and Immortal X-Men hints at why that would be the case. He knows the X-Men's mutant metaphor doesn't quite work, and he's wary of pushing against its limits. This is especially important in regards to the MLK/Malcolm X comparisons that so often get drawn. Magneto has done a whole bunch of actual atrocities in canon, whatever you might think of the character, and at this point in the canon, so is Professor X. Neither of those men have the same experience as the civil rights leaders they are held against, growing up as black men in a society that literally kept black people as slaves. Magneto and Professor X, despite the former's past experiences, pass as white humans. They do not experience the day-to-day struggles of black Americans. And what's more, it does a disservice to the memory and work of Dr. King and Malcolm X to draw this parallel. People should be actively looking into the works of these men and other civil rights leaders and learning from them. X-Men stories, as much as I love them, are no substitute for the years of work people like Dr. King and Malcolm X put into the civil rights movement. And hiding the true image of these men behind these drawings of white people put out for mass entertainment, as much as it hurts me to say it, contributes to the sanitization of these figures, especially King. These figures marketed for a mainstream American audience. The claws filed off, their socialist beliefs forgotten, the way they were treated and the way that they were killed forgotten in the rehabilitation of their images as peaceful, non-disruptive American heroes, rather than what they actually were. Socialists, activists, revolutionaries no less, and people whose words deserve to be heard rather than paraphrased by people like, well, like me. With all that said, with this recent comparison of trans people to mutants in Florida, the mutant metaphor has escaped its cage, so to speak. It's out there in public, and members of state governments are drawing parallels. So what do we do with this information? What can we learn from this, and can we do anything about it besides rage? Well, in my view, as a trans woman who is increasingly panicked about these anti-trans moves by politicians on both sides of the Atlantic, we can take solace in the fact that even if sitting state congressmen don't see the X-Men as the good guys in the stories that bear their name, most people do. And I think in the end this is quite telling. The far right in the US is losing their war on trans and queer people. They are losing the support of the citizenry, and they are resorting to increasingly drastic tactics to hold on to their rapidly dissolving worldview. They know that if they don't put all their cards on the table right now, that they've lost the battle for public opinion, and they're getting desperate. It helps us to have them directly call us out like this. They recognise the role they're playing. They see us as mutants, as inhuman, not like the Marvel universe Inhumans, but they see us as a not human, as many fascist groups have talked about their targets before. They are letting us know how dangerous they think we are. In a way, they've bought into the mutant metaphor even more than they should. In a way that the current roster of X-Men writers would shy away from. They don't agree with Charles Xavier that mutants are set apart by their power, by the status as both metaphor for persecuted minorities and fantasy for those minorities dreaming of winning against the world that's holding them back. They see us as dangerous. They see us as little Magnetos. They see the power we could potentially wield against them. And just like the X-Men, they hate and fear us for it. Of course, we can't move metal with our minds, for now, but might we not take them up on their invitation here? Might we not take up the standard of the X-Men and fight against this obvious threat to not just us, but everyone who objects to the emergence of fascism in America and worldwide? And if we can do that, we might find that we have more power than we realise. United, maybe we can move bridges. Maybe we can be the perfect foils to the Sentinels they will send to kill us. Maybe with a united front, we can do more than any of us can do alone. Maybe they're right. Maybe we do have the power to stop this onslaught. Perhaps we shouldn't balk at the poisonous words of a politician using mutant as a slur against us, and instead hold ourselves high, mutant and proud. Thanks for watching. With Magneto, I felt like they set him up for so long as this sort of reformed guy, this hero. He's like learning to, but then everyone's also coming to his point of view as well. And then I feel like in the 90s, they sort of just decided, no, let's make him a villain again.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I feel like when I think about it, I rarely see a situation where the humans prove themselves to be worthy of trust. So it's one of those situations where it's like, why do we think that this is going to be like great? Like, why is Professor X so optimistic about the future between mutants and regular people? I don't really see a lot of evidence that that's real.
I definitely think I mean, I don't know when, I think you might have started reading earlier than me, but I mean, I was picking up like I really got into X-Men around the time like House of M and then AVX came out not long after. And I feel like that's if you wanted people to feel like a connection to the humans rather than the mutants, it's probably not helpful to have them do all that terrible stuff they were doing.
Yeah, it's like you read Days of Future Past and it's like, wow, it's like, you know, just a whole little genocide, you know, just like, sounds great. Good job, humans.
Hi, I have a YouTube channel. It's all right, I guess. I don't know. It took me a year to get to 10,000 subscribers, which is in some metrics very, very good. In other metrics,
that's pretty good.
If I was, oh, you want to come for the vibe? Well, the vibe is maybe I'll talk about the fascist and like false conscious roots of transphobia, or maybe I'll talk about how Fable 3 thinks that landlording is good. Who knows?
I mean, to be fair, that's just entirely all of my shit. So I'm sure there are people watching who it was also entirely their shit. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for talking to me. I'll have to talk to you again sometimes when I do this Wolverine thing because I got so much to talk about. This has been really good. Can you tell people where they can find your stuff?
Sure. I am on Twitter at Weeks Princess, Weekes. I am on TikTok a lot more now as Princess Pendulum. And on YouTube, you can find me through my name, Princess Weeks. And I try to put out at least 1 to 2 videos a month. And then on Patreon, we do movie nights. We just watched the Sailor Moon Promise of the Rose original 90s dub, which I still own on VHS. And we do like movie nights and commentaries, and we watch weird fun pilots. I believe right now the pilot for Revolution Girl Utena is leading the charge, so we have good times there.
Amazing. All right, thank you so much. This has been really great. I had like too few people I can just talk about X-Men with, so hey everyone, if you like this video and you want to help me eat and sleep and not be sad, why not sign up to the Patreon for as little as £1 a month, or donate to coffee. One-time donations. If you're not one of those people that has the funds to do it all the time and share this video with your friends, why not like and subscribe? Maybe if you sign up to my Patreon, not only will you get videos multiple days before everyone else every single week, but you will also get your name read out at the end of each video, just like these lovely people who you should personally thank. Without them, this would not have been possible. So, thank you to H, Deanna McMillan, Tweak, Carolyn Regalado, Jenny Linsky, Alexandra Lilly, Jay Peterson, Amber Chera, Howard Lott, Lara Van Loon, Darren Nia Scarjan, and Joey Cobalt. I love you all. You have made my life so much easier. Thank you so much. I'm so happy I can do this and even get money for it. Jesus Christ, what a life-changing experience. Anyway, thank you so much from me, from Dan, and everyone here at the Daily Telegraph. Goodbye! And Magneto was right.
Someone took it there, and someone fleshed out this character that was supposed to be a cartoon villain, and now, like from just a pure writing perspective, you've kind of gotten everyone else into a mess. Like, whether or not you did a great job and that was a really cool representation, now everyone else has to grapple with the reality of like, okay, do we just make like a new guy who's just a generic like aha kind of villain, or do you have what do you do then, you know? Because not everyone who really likes Magneto is going to be equipped to like write that story, a story where he has that depth again. And like, I mean, I guess that's kind of what the like Sunday morning cartoon version would be for. Again, they're not gonna gonna go, oh, the whole Magneto was right, he's a Holocaust survivor, here's some imagery in that, you know, like that's a space where you can go, it's fine that he's just like going to like pick up all of the world's gold and like hurtle it into the sun by putting it in a better metal that he can control and throwing it there. Like, you know, he could just do nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, that would be based though, actually. So we should do that.
It's like I bought a printer and I found this really great. It was like this thruple Jean, Scott, and Logan fan art, and I was just like, I'm just gonna print this.
Yes.
And put it on my cork board, and I just it's got like a little bit of like I post it over the naughty bits, but they're there.